Hey everyone, Quentin Figueroa here with Crowd Freedom, and I wanted to talk to you about when does a child become an adult in a free society. So this is obviously a fairly controversial and tricky topic to discuss, but I wanted to give you my take on it and hopefully shed some light on a few parts. So let me start off with a definition of a child and an adult so we have kind of a framework to go with. So, the definition for a child is a young human being below the age of puberty or below the age of majority. A son or daughter of any age, an immature or irresponsible person, a person who has little or no experience in a particular area, the descendants of a family or people, a person or thing influenced by a specific environment. And now if we look at the definition for adult, a person who is fully grown or developed, a fully developed animal, a person who has reached the age of majority. So we can see here with these definitions that they're kind of what you would expect. They're kind of broad and general, and they say, things that don't give a specific on when that transition takes place between a child to an adult. We understand those definitions, but we don't have like a set metric. And there are, different criteria that we can use for when a child is an adult. Different societies use different metrics right now, and some of those metrics might be the age of the individual, the ability for that individual to reproduce, the brain development for that individual, the responsibility level, and then the culture and societal norms. And now, obviously with these, it's still tricky because different people reach these metrics at different speeds and times. So it's not, a set way that it works. You might have so say if we're going with age, right? As soon as somebody reaches the age of 18, that doesn't immediately make them an adult. And it's possible to have somebody who's 15 that acts more like an adult than somebody who's 30. So just because you reach a certain age doesn't necessarily mean that you are actually an adult at that point. If we were to look at something like the ability to reproduce, again, people hit puberty and people are able to reproduce at different ages. Not everybody is within the same age range. Some people might hit a little bit later, some might hit a little bit earlier. And just because you're able to reproduce, is that the only thing that should be taken into account when determining whether you're an adult or not? Because you have another very important issue such as brain development. And brain development for some people, it's generally understood that brain development takes about 25 to 30 years before you reach full maturity on brain development. So if we were going off brain development, then it's going to be a lot longer of a maturity range. It's going to take you a lot longer to mature. If you were going off puberty, that might be, around 12 years old or so. But if you're going off brain development, it might be up to around 30 years. So you have this huge range with brain development, and kind of depending on which way you're looking into it. And then, of course, responsibility level. Some people are responsible at a younger age. Some people are responsible, or some people never fully get responsible even into their adulthood, right? So there's still this range and this gray area, and it's just kind of very specific almost to each person. There are definitely trends, but there are always exceptions and kind of gray areas, and that's where it gets kind of tricky. And then of course you have cultural and societal norms where different societies may be okay with people becoming adults sooner, and other societies may prefer for people to become adults later once they've perhaps developed more or have more information and experience in just life in general to be able to then, fit in as an adult in society. So there's a wide range of ways to look at it, and it varies from person to person. And just because somebody meets one criteria doesn't mean they meet the other. And just because somebody is an adult does not mean that they're more of an adult than a child. It's possible for a child to act and be more like an adult than the actual adult. So it's tricky. Now, since we're talking about a free society, when it comes to disputes or gray areas in a free society, it comes down to property. And when you're dealing with property as far as humans, you're dealing with self-ownership. So the main difference in a free society between an adult and a child would be less about these kind of age or brain development metrics, but more about property and self-ownership. And property and self-ownership is a better metric to use for determining this, because when people are consenting to do things voluntarily, that is them exercising self-ownership and their property. So when you as an individual choose to make an exchange with somebody else, you are consenting that that is what you want. And by consenting for something, you are showing your self-ownership, and you're showing that you own your actions and the effects of your actions. So when it comes to how it would work in a free society, we're going to look more along the lines of property and self-ownership. Now, obviously, this is still kind of gray, right? Because a 2-year-old does not own themselves fully. Their parents pretty much take care of them. They are unable to take care of themselves and to participate in society. They're just not developed enough. So the ownership of the child is basically superseded by the parents. So the parents are taking self-ownership of the child. So they essentially, by proxy, take ownership of that child's decisions and their actions for a certain time. And obviously, as the child grows, learns, and becomes more mature, that range starts to narrow, and the child eventually becomes an adult and starts to take full ownership of their actions. But there is definitely that gray area in that maturity period, which is, obvious and needs to be acknowledged. So when two parties exchange, right? So if a child, like a 15-year-old, is going to buy alcohol from a 30-year-old, this is an exchange. A 15-year-old, to the best of their ability, to the best of their knowledge, is deciding to purchase the alcohol, and the 30-year-old is deciding to sell the alcohol. So these are both voluntary actions on the two parties involved. So if the 15-year-old is not fully aware or fully capable of assuming that responsibility, right? Maybe they're not fully mature to know kind of whether or not purchasing alcohol is a good decision for themselves. Then the 30-year-old who is selling it to them is assuming that risk by selling it to them. So when there is an exchange going on in a free society, the parties involved, both people, need to understand the self-ownership and the consent that the other person is giving. And if the person is a child or is not a full consent to do what they are doing, then it comes onto the person that is the adult to take ownership of that, and they're the one who is consenting with somebody who's not fully mature. There's a lot more ways to look at this, but this is just something to kind of realize, is that the responsibility comes on the adult and not the child. If you have we'll get into it in a second. So let me give you a quote by Murray Rothbard. Okay, so the question is when does a child practice full self-ownership? Because that's kind of what we need to understand. Because when you can determine when you have ownership of yourself, then that is basically when you are an adult. When you can make decisions for yourself and be yourself without other people, right? So when you have self-ownership, that's that's a good starting point for when you're an adult. So let's see what Maury Rothbard has to say on this. He says, quote, "Regardless of his age, we must grant to every child the absolute right to run away and to find new foster parents who will voluntarily adopt him, or to try to exist on his own. Parents may try to persuade the runaway child to return, but it is totally impermissible enslavement and an aggression upon his right of self-ownership for them to use force to compel him to return. The absolute right to run away is a child's ultimate expression of his right of self-ownership, regardless of age." End quote. So that is a pretty good starting point on self-ownership, because it's basically showing when a child is able to be on their own, they are choosing to be on their own without force, and by choosing to be on their own, they are now able to take responsibility for themselves. If a child is living on their own and they are making decisions, those decisions now belong to them. The parents can't use force to keep the child with them, because in order to have property, you can't have your property aggressed against. That's the non-aggression principle. And for a child to show ownership of their property and voluntarily leave their parents' house, regardless of the age, but maybe, around 18 or so, when a child leaves and is taking ownership, and when they're able to live on their own outside of the resources of their parents, they're basically showing self-ownership. So that's pretty much what Maury Rothbard is saying there, and I think that's a pretty good guideline of when a child is an adult, when they're able to live on their own and support themselves. Obviously, it's not a definitive answer, and there's a lot of gray area, and that's where courts and other things come in to kind of help clear up certain examples and cases. But let's continue. So, a lot of this will come down to how society itself will process a lot of this, because a free society is going to have its own norms, right? Certain societies, it might be normal for a 14-year-old to be an adult, but in a free society, that may not be normal. So it kind of depends on what the free society itself feels, and how through the market system and all the market forces at play, including common law, and how all these things come into effect on what will be kind of the normal thing for society, right? So certain metrics for certain types of examples or exchanges will come into play, and that is something that society will determine. So for instance, say you have a 30-year-old selling alcohol to a 10-year-old. Most people in a free society will probably not be okay with this. And as a result of that, the courts and the market in general would be built around these decisions, these choices from the individuals in the free society. The whole market would be built around that not being acceptable, so courts and common law would rule with that not being acceptable. So, based on the repercussions and ramifications of that exchange, if the 30-year-old were to sell alcohol to a 10-year-old, he would face the penalties that is, fit for that type of aggression, or that type of transaction where there's not full ownership of the child, right? So 10-year-old buying alcohol from a 30-year-old, probably not acceptable. A 15-year-old buying alcohol from a 30-year-old, that gets a little bit more acceptable, right? It's not quite as extreme. And then when you move to, say, a 20-year-old buying alcohol from a 30-year-old, pretty much nobody is going to have much of a problem with that, because, in the case of alcohol, when a person is around that age range, they're more capable of handling something like that, and it's just not a big deal. 20-year-old choosing to buy alcohol and consume it is different than a 10-year-old choosing to buy alcohol and consume it. So that's something to think about. Now, let's look at another example. Say you have a 40-year-old that is consenting to have sex with a 30-year-old. Now, most people are going to be perfectly okay with that, you would think, right? That would be pretty normal in a society, in a free society for the most part. Now, what about a 40-year-old with a 20-year-old? So that is still probably okay, but it's getting a little bit more questionable, I think, for some people. Some people might be a little bit more concerned on why that's happening and what the ramifications are, and that kind of thing. The self-ownership of the 20-year-old versus a 40-year-old. Why is the 40-year-old doing that? And that kind of thing. So it gets a little bit more gray. Now, a 40-year-old having sex with a 15-year-old. Now, this is really going to cross a line where pretty much nobody in a free society would be okay with that, because it's pretty acknowledged that a 15-year-old having sex with an older person, especially that old, 40, it's a totally different type of relationship, and it's the consent of the 15-year-old to do that. There are different types of factors going into it than if, say, they were having sex with a 16-year-old. So that will all be taken into account in a free society on kind of on what society views as kind of normal and not normal, right? So I don't think many people in a free society would be okay as much with a 15-year-old having sex with a 40-year-old. And in that case, it would come down on the 40-year-old, because in any exchange, the two parties, or the parties involved in the exchange, which in this case would be a 40-year-old and a 15-year-old, in this exchange, both party is taking ownership of that action, right? Now, most people would argue that the 40-year-old has full understanding and ownership of that action. And I think many people would argue that the 15-year-old does not have full ownership of that action. So by having a 40-year-old have sex with a 15-year-old, they are understanding of what they're doing, and they're consenting voluntarily to do that. And if that is something that courts and society would deem as wrong and an aggression on another human being, then they are taking that risk, and they are taking ownership of the results of that risk. So whatever penalties they face from a court and from society is something that they are consenting to when they do that act, where the 15-year-old person is not consenting in the same way as a 40-year-old, because they do not have or exercise self-ownership to the degree that the 40-year-old does in that specific case. Obviously, it could be. You could have a 15-year-old who is more mature and able to consent than a 40-year-old, but I'm just saying that kind of for argument, but I really don't think that's going to happen. It's possible, but I mean, it's obviously not probably going to ever really be the case. But you have to look at each individual, each property owner. You have to understand to the degree that they're able to consent and these types of things, and there's a lot to it. But in general, I mean, it kind of makes sense on how that would work. And then it's the same type of thing. If you had a 30-year-old and a 15-year-old, right? So that's still probably not okay. 30-year-old, 15-year-old having sex. If you were to have a 20-year-old and a 15-year-old have sex, that is probably a little bit more okay, but it still is, I think, weird for a lot of people, and it probably would be handled in a less favorable way, right? An 18-year-old with a 15-year-old. See, now you're getting closer to where it's an 18-year-old with a 15-year-old is a lot different than a 40-year-old with a 15-year-old, right? So in a free society, people know this, and courts, which are built on the markets, would be very good at kind of determining the consent going into that and the ownership of your actions going into that. So that's something to note and think about. So a lot of this, as far as a child and adult relationship, it comes down to risk. Because when an older person is doing business or consenting or some type of exchange with a younger person, they are taking a risk. If an adult has sex with another adult, right, a 40-year-old and a 40-year-old, there's no real risk. Both parties are consenting to that. 40-year-old, 30-year-old, no real risk. They're both capable of self-ownership. The risk comes when an adult is doing an exchange with a child, or somebody that is in kind of that range of a child. And in a free society, adults are going to know this. I mean, in a regular society, adults already know this. It's obvious. People know that they're taking a risk by operating and doing exchanges with younger people. So it works the same way in a free society, and there's a risk involved. When you, as an adult, exchange with a younger person, you're taking a risk and assuming that risk and the penalties that come with it. Where the child does not assume as much risk because they don't have full self-ownership. So anyway, let's move on. So this is similar kind of to a situation right now in like an emergency room situation. If somebody is in an emergency room and they go under some type of anesthesia to where they're no longer conscious, and the doctor is doing surgery on them, that takes the adult out of being able to make decisions for themselves. They're basically in a non-decision mode, kind of like in a way like a child, right? Where they're at the mercy of this other person. And it's up to this doctor to assume the risk of what they do to that adult while they're unconscious. So it's a similar situation where you have the doctor taking a risk, and he has to uphold that he's not going to do something that could hurt or kill or harm that person while they are unable to take ownership of themselves and while they're unconscious. So you don't want to have a doctor sew limbs on or do something crazy to the person while they are unconscious. It's that same type of thing with an adult and a child, right? So that doctor is assuming that risk, and if he were to do something, the courts and the legal system, society in general, would come down on him for that, and he would probably have his medical abilities revoked, or it'd be known really well, and people would not do business with him anymore because of the way he handled that risk and the way that he took advantage of somebody when they were unable to fully show self-ownership. So when you have something that has the potential for risk, right? We have an entire industry built up around risk, and that industry is insurance. And now something like insurance would come into effect very similar in a free society for things like exchanges between two consenting parties. When you have risk for something, it's possible to have insurance to help cover that risk. Now, insurance could come in a few different ways, but two common ways, especially when dealing with adults and children, two common ways that you could have an insurance would be through co-signing and through underwriting. So not all children, like we talked about earlier, not all children are incapable of making adult decisions, and not all children are incapable of self-ownership in certain areas. You might have children that mature quicker. And if they mature quicker and they want to contract and exchange with adults, then it should be possible for them to do so. But the adults are going to be wary to do things with children because they know the repercussions would be much greater if they were to do something wrong. So because of this, it's possible to have either parents or an insurance company assume the risk of the child by basically co-signing for them or underwriting them. So if a child is capable, and maybe for their job they need to have a license to drive on roads, right? So a child normally can't do this. But if you had a 14-year-old that was very capable, they've taken all the tests, they've proven themselves worthy and able to do this, it would be possible to have their parents co-sign on that driving ability, to where now if somebody were to have them drive on their roads, right, the parents would be assuming that risk now and not the child, because the parents are co-signing for it. They're basically saying, no, put me in charge of these decisions. I approve of the decisions of this child, right? So Another example would be something like a child, maybe a child, maybe the whole family is into kind of like a weapons business, right? Or maybe like a DRO type company. So a child now, you have a 14-year-old that is very capable of being in a weapons business. And in order to do this, they need to purchase and sell weapons. And most people in a free society are not going to sell weapons to a child because they're assuming that risk by doing so, and courts would come down probably on them pretty hard. So if a child needed to do this though, and they were capable of it the same way an adult is, they could have their parents co-sign and basically say, no, if this child does business with another adult to purchase firearms, we are taking the risk and saying that he is capable of doing that. And in that case, if the child were to buy the weapons and do something crazy or, misuse that ability, it wouldn't come down on the child, or it wouldn't come down on the seller because the seller's dealing with the child. It would not come down on the seller in this case. It would come down on the parents because in this case, the child is acting as an adult via proxy of the co-signing of the parents. So it comes down on the parents now. It's basically like the parents are doing the firearms deal with the other adult seller, right? So you have this going on. And then underwriting would work pretty much the same way, except rather than having parents do the co-signing, you're going to have an external like insurance company that is basically underwriting the activity. They're basically giving the person the green light. They're giving the child the green light to do this activity for like a set fee or whatever it is, right? And so the insurance company, if a child was needing to purchase firearms or something like this, the insurance company would have, certain tests that could be taken, certain licensing, certain types of things, contracts that could be signed and done between the child and them in order to prove that the child is a capable, consenting adult showing full self-ownership for this particular task. And because of this, if somebody was selling the firearms to the child, the child would be able to show them the certificate that it's underwritten by a specific company, and the adult selling the firearms would be comfortable doing this because they would know that the risk is now on the insurance company and not them. So you have underwriting as a possibility for children if they need to, mature quicker or, interact in society where it might be questionable for certain individuals to participate with them. Co-signing and underwriting come into play. And of course, people would be kind of concerned, well, what if a kid were to just pay lots of money, had rich parents, and they basically got him underwritten for everything because, he had unlimited funds and he could just pay insurance companies a lot of money so he could do whatever he wanted at age 13 or whatever. But if you understand markets and how markets work, then that type of thing isn't really possible because the insurance underwriters need to make a profit. And if they're underwriting children that are not capable of being underwritten and the children are going to do something stupid, that then when they do that stupid thing, the insurance company is on the hook for it. They're going to go to court. They're going to face legal fees. They're going to face the society in general seeing that they're underwriting these children, and a lot of people aren't going to want to do business with them, and existing customers are going to leave, and all that type of thing. So you have market forces keeping everybody in check and that type of thing, which I think most people would kind of understand how that works. So, it's pretty, I think it would work kind of similar. I think it would work like this, basically. And you're not going to have, like, an insurance company underwriting a 13-year-old to have sex. Because if they do, that insurance company depends on people paying them money to support them. And if you have insurance companies underwriting minors to have sex, or things that people would find totally appalling, then nobody's going to do business with them. They're going to lose money. They're going to go out of business. So because of the way markets work and the profit incentive and just needing capital and resources in order to operate, you're going to have to provide a valuable service, and you're going to have to be very smart and particular about how you underwrite and co-sign for different individuals. So you're going to be careful about it, and that's the beauty of markets, is that they they regulate themselves through society. Society is voting for the markets, voting for the best ways to handle co-signing and underwriting by the companies that they pay money to. So if people in society did not like what these insurance companies were doing, they would stop supporting them. And yeah, so that's how that works. So at the end of the day, this all comes down to, so rather than using a metric, right, like age or brain development or something like this, which are all very valid metrics and they would be used, but I think an even more valid metric and something more fundamental and something that is most important is self-ownership. And self-ownership is property. And property is, as I always discuss, property is a foundation for a free society. If you can have property that is not aggressed against, then that is the basis for how a free society would work. And it's not like there would be, most societies are built around kind of what people feel in general, what people kind of, they're based around the mean of majority of people and their decisions and their kind of culture and their kind of bias, their preferences. Different cultures kind of see things different ways. And most people live in cultures that jive with the way that they think and the way that they feel and express themselves. So people in a free society would kind of have certain ways they view children on certain types of things, right? So gambling, sex, alcohol and drugs, cigarettes, licenses for driving, all these kind of things. Society in general is the piece that determines that, and the way that society determines that is basically enforced and regulated through the court system, which basically follows the will of the court system follows the societal preference by the way people voluntarily support these courts and these legal systems with their money. So what the society pays for is basically what they're supporting. And society is going to support insurance companies, courts, legal systems, businesses that follow kind of the ethics and the will that this society has. And it could be different from free society to free society, and people could live in the free society that closely champions kind of their view. So hopefully that kind of gives you an understanding of how that works, because at the end of the day, it comes down to the people more than it does some type of like rote metric like age or things like that. And another thing that's worth mentioning is that the goal of society, at least a free society, you can remove gray areas, right? That's kind of what we try to do, is we try to remove gray areas by coming up with principles and fundamental ways to deal with them. But there are still going to be gray areas, even if you kind of have ways to deal with it. Even if we say, like say in America, right, the age where people are, for the most part, an adult is 18. For certain things, it's 21. But like 18 to 21, that's kind of the adult range in America. And it's just because, where am I going with this? By doing it this way in America, it's basically removing a gray area to where if you don't fit within that box, then you're either a child or an adult. If you're not 18, you're a child in America. As soon as you become 18, you're now an adult. So it's like, it hurts people that might be adults that are younger, like say a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old. And then it also hurts people that are adults that might be more children, because it's basically removing gray area, and putting it into kind of a fine metric line that divides the two, where I don't necessarily think that's the best way to handle things, not just the adult-child relationship, but a lot of things in a free society, where things that are gray, that's where courts and, specific kind of specific kind of mediations can occur for these things. Rather than saying when somebody hits a certain thing they're this, you should be able to have a system that's more open to kind of weigh on the gray areas and have good courts and legal systems through a free market, which you would. It'd be better to kind of offset that onto them and not say like, these are the rules, have a bunch of different rules. You basically have property as your main law, and you let the courts and society in general regulate the gray areas around that. That to me seems like a much more open, fair, and scalable system. So that's hopefully gives you a good understanding of that. That is my take on the situation and how that would work. And I'm always interested to hear what others have to say. And the website Crowd Freedom is built to have you ask and answer different questions. So if you guys have a different take than me on this, please share it. And I'd love to hear what others have to say, because the discussion is open and there's a lot to discuss on these types of things. If you find this video valuable, please comment and subscribe and like it and share it with your friends. I'm really happy to get this kind of information out, and I really want to hear the feedback that everyone has on this type of thing. So thank you very much for listening. Have a great day.